Hi, today's lecture is going to be about the practice of therapeutics and the changes that took place in medical practice and theory as a result of the bacteriological revolution. This story will take us from roughly 1820, maybe a little before, let's say 1800, all the way about to 1890. And a lot changed over this time. First, our story begins, as so many stories in this course have begun, with Benjamin Rush. As you remember, he was a devoted and admiring student of his teacher at Edinburgh, William Cullen, but he rejected Cullen's emphasis on the system of nosology, the classification of diseases on the basis of symptoms. Rush gradually came not only to reject Cullen's work, but indeed all attempts at nosology, staking out his new position with a declaration that all varieties of fever were in fact a single entity defined by, quote, irregular convulsive action of the blood vessels. He compared it to fire, which was a single process, a single phenomenon, despite the apparent differences in flames, quote, be they produced by friction, percussion, electricity, fermentation, or by a piece of wood or coal in a state of inflammation. Similarly, although inflammation of the tissues might manifest in different ways, such as tonsillitis or a rash, Rush insisted that any search for specific classifications were a waste of time, because they all shared the same underlying principle. By 1796, Rush was willing to go further still, extending the framework to encompass all disease. Quote, I have formerly said that there is but one fever in the world. Be not startled, gentlemen. Follow me, and I will say there is but one disease in the world. The proximate cause of disease is irregular, convulsive action in the system affected. That is to say, that the solidist theory of tissues becoming excited and relaxed, for Rush became the sole cause of disease, or the sole mechanism of disease of any kind, because of his prominence in both the national and international medical community. His unitary theory had dramatic implications for debates over disease control in general. Most importantly, Rush's unitary theory of disease came with an utter rejection of the theory of contagious transmission of disease. That is to say, Rush did not believe that disease could be spread from person to person. And that was an important departure from centuries of common Galenist practice. Contagion had long been recognized as a phenomenon governing the spread of disease in European medical traditions, reaching back almost as far as Galen himself. In place of contagion, Rush offered one primary mechanism for the spread of disease. Rather than being spread from person to person, disease was generated in particular places by miasmas. And you might remember seeing that word, miasma, earlier in the semester. The kind of environmental cause of disease, the pathogenic vapor, the cloud of environmental factors that together made a place healthy or sick. Rush made recourse to this even older theory of disease prevalence to make his case against contagion. And when I say he made a case against contagion, I mean that he, as I said, rejected it utterly. He argued that the claim that diseases were contagious and could be averted by quarantine would one day, he said, be held in the same regard as claims that diseases were caused by witchcraft. What's amazing is that this anti-contagionist position within or by 1825 or so became dominant in medical opinion on both sides of the Atlantic. As established physicians struggled to control outbreaks of yellow fever, outbreaks of cholera, they were increasingly subscribing to Rush's view that contagion was a superstition of the past, one that would not even raise interest if it were not for the backwards opinions and filthy conditions of many European and American cities. Instead, they focused on two factors, and this debate has been called the dirt versus dearth debate. Dearth, D-E-A-R-T-H, is a word meaning shortage or lack. And so, the anti-contagionist spectrum of opinion embraced two models of disease. The first focused on dirt, that is to say, the environmental conditions in cities, and Rush tended to focus on these kinds of questions. A dissenting view was held by those who argued that disease outbreaks were concentrated among the poor in dirty cities, not because of dirt, but because of dearth, that shortage or lack of money, lack of sufficient food, lack of resources to clean houses and clothing, lack of everything that fortified wealthier people against disease outbreak. So, as the dirt versus dearth debate raged from throughout the cholera years and until the rise of Pasteur, Koch, and the bacteriological revolution, mainstream, conventional, university-trained medicine was a medicine that rejected contagion, that embraced heroic therapy, and that for these reasons, among others, was vulnerable to the challenges of the eclectics. Next, I'd like to talk about how anti-contagionist doctrine shaped American responses to cholera, which first struck the U.S. in 1832. Cholera was a defining problem of cities during the 19th century. Along with tuberculosis, it, in many ways, defined the medical landscape of the 19th century American city. Yellow fever had largely abated in the North, and vaccination was making smallpox a thing of the past. By our best guesses, the bacterium that causes cholera, Vibrio, originates in the Ganges River Valley of India. As far as we can tell, there had never been an outbreak of cholera outside of the Indian subcontinent before 1817. What brought it to Europe and beyond was the British Empire, the expansion of railways, the expansion of transit links between India, Europe, and the rest of the world, brought cholera along with everything else. Well, yeah, close enough. Along with everything else. Now, cholera spreads through the human digestive system and can enter the body through any route leading into the digestive system. From there, it moves through the body and, while taking up residence in one host, spreads itself along what is called the fecal-oral route. You can probably figure out what that means, but just to make sure, it came out through the rectum or anus and contaminated water supplies, where it would then spread to other victims. Symptoms of cholera included spasmodic vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach cramps. With all of that vomiting and diarrhea came massive dehydration. Once the body was dehydrated to that extent, the liver and the kidneys both stopped processing food and toxins properly. Cyanosis begins to set in, and ultimately leads to the failure of organs as the individual with cholera is unable to drink enough water fast enough to keep up with the dehydrating effects of the cholera. So, cholera moved outside of Europe in 1817, moved outside of Asia, rather, in 1817, and a long series of outbreaks began in 1831. As a unitary model of disease, embracing an anti-contagionist viewpoint tended to dominate medical discussion, most doctors rejected calls for quarantine, instead emphasizing the value of municipal sanitation as a means of arresting the spread of the disease. Municipal, regional, and national boards of health began to enforce more and more stringent regulations about life and filth in the cities. In some parts of Europe, cholera outbreaks came alongside outbreaks of xenophobia. The migration of Eastern Europeans into Western Europe, Western and Central Europe, especially Eastern European Jews, was happening at the same time that cholera was arriving from India. Taking the coincidental arrival of these human and microbial newcomers as too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence, many European cities launched pogroms and other examples of ethnic cleansing to try to drive the still small populations of Jewish and other Eastern European newcomers out of their communities. Very little that the physicians did seemed to have much effect on the outbreaks of cholera. Still obsessed with the generic idea of cleanliness as the absence of dirt, and prior to the work of Pasteur and Koch, medical professionals missed the big picture, which is that it was not dirt itself, but microbes, pathogens that caused disease. After spreading across Europe, cholera, well, it was only a matter of time before cholera moved across the Atlantic as well. The first American outbreak occurred in 1832. The next was a long stretch of intermittent outbreaks from 1848 to 1854. And the third major outbreak was in 1866. So, as reports of the spread of cholera arrived in the U.S., many knew it was only a matter of time. And in the summer of that year, soon all of the major ports, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, all issued quarantine orders, in many cases over the objections of the medical communities that served those cities. Under quarantine, these ports nonetheless were subject to infection. And the municipal health boards of these cities struggled to contain outbreaks of this scale and nature. New York, for example, lagged behind Philadelphia in its water system, and only 3 men were responsible for maintaining the health of 250,000 people who lived in New York. The 1832 outbreak was only a season, but it was devastating. Thousands died. In the short term, it led to support for expanded powers for health inspectors and public health officials. But in the longer term, once the immediate crisis was over, many were willing to go back to business as usual. Indeed, some public officials even embraced a perversely providential view of the disease. As the governor of New York declared, quote, "An infinitely wise and just God has seen fit to employ pestilence as one means of scourging the human race for their sins, and it seems to be an appropriate one for the sins of uncleanliness and intemperance." Some might find the governor's proclamation heartless, problematic. But the idea of a poor man's plague, a disease that seemed particularly prone to striking the most marginalized, those who had the least, also awakened a sense of sympathy in others. So it was not necessarily a uniform response. Public health officials continued to struggle with cholera, in the United States at least, until the 1866 outbreak. That outbreak took place in the aftermath of the Civil War. And American doctors had learned much in the 30 years since that first outbreak. Specifically, they had learned from the example of one Jon Snow. Now, feel free to make up your own Game of Thrones jokes, but this Jon Snow was a London physician, and he was an anesthesiologist, administering ether to patients. And the one thing that he learned from anesthesia was that gases expand to fill the spaces that they occupy. That is to say, that when he was administering ether, once he moved the mouthpiece of the etherizing unit more than a few inches from the face of the patient whom he was etherizing, the gas would disperse so rapidly that it had almost no effect on the person or anyone else in the room, because it would expand to fill the space into such a low concentration that it had no effect. Now, given that he knew this about ether, he reasoned that the same held true of miasma, whatever it was, whatever the nature of this vapor was, if it was anything like any known gas, then the patterns of infection should be highly concentrated around the source of the vapor, but falling off a cliff once they moved even a slight distance away. That wasn't how it worked. So, Snow set out to explain the common factor in his neighborhood of Soho. He did this by conducting door-to-door interviews throughout the neighborhood, taking a census of everyone who lived there, every house with cholera, every house without cholera, when people noticed they were sick, and so forth. Working with the Anglican minister, Henry Whitehead, Snow was able to put together the pieces of the cholera puzzle. The common factor among all the houses was that they all drew water from the same well. London, in the 1850s, had two major water companies. The failure of this company to sanitize the well in question, or the source of their water, was the cause of the cholera outbreak in London in 1854. Snow's work was another piece of this puzzle that was slowly coming together to explain why diseases spread in the patterns that they did. A decisive blow against the theory of miasma. Snow's work, like Pasteur's, emphasized the role of specific causative agents producing a variety of distinct and differentiated diseases. This is how he inaugurates the idea, or contributes to the growing consensus that Rush is wrong, that there is more than one disease, that there is a whole variety of diseases. The last major part of this lecture is about what happened between the first and the final major outbreaks of cholera in the U.S., specifically about the Civil War and its relationship to medicine. Now, the Civil War was the deadliest war in American history. 600,000 deaths. But as with the Revolution and every other American war until World War II, disease was a far bigger killer than enemy bullets or blades. 2 times as many Americans died from infections and diseases during the war as died from direct enemy action. As in other wars, soldiers during the Civil War suffered from deprivation, malnutrition, exposure, and the multitude of diseases spurred by close proximity and poor hygiene. They spread it not only to other soldiers, but to civilian populations as well. Whenever they billeted in a local city or in a community, they spread the disease to others. Aware of the risks involved with it of infection and disease, and sympathetic to the plight of the Union soldiers, a group of women in New York began a remarkable campaign to prevent, or at least reduce, the number of deaths associated with disease. They began in April 1861, shortly after the war had begun in earnest. In April of 1861, the women of New York founded the Women's Central Relief Association. Their delegation approached Secretary of War Henry Stinson and asked him to appoint a sanitary commission to improve conditions in military encampments and to ensure that men in the field were not being exposed to excessive disease risks brought on by poor hygiene or lack of hygienic materials. Stinson, the Secretary of War, declined at first, but the women were undeterred. By June, they were able to reach Lincoln himself, and Lincoln countermanded Stinson's initial decision, ordering him to establish the United States Sanitary Commission, developed out of the efforts of the Women's Central Relief Association. The U.S. Sanitary Commission had models for public health relief based on things like the Pennsylvania Hospital, but more specifically based on public health efforts in cities like New York, Baltimore, and Boston that had tried outreach to poorer populations in order to ameliorate health risks associated with poverty. The Sanitary Commission was originally intended merely to serve in an advisory capacity to the Secretary of War, suggesting improvements for conditions in the camps. But they ended up serving a major and direct role in military relief. Beyond merely exerting constant political pressure to provide soldiers in the field with hygiene and nutrition, they also deployed visitors, inspectors to the camps to monitor conditions. In addition, they also served as a kind of clearinghouse to gather contributions for the war effort. Things like clean linen for bandages, and clean linens for bedclothes. A lot of clean linen, in fact, but also food, medicine, and other necessaries that they could then package and send to those encampments where the need was the most acute. As the war expanded into the South, and as Union troops liberated southern cities, the U.S. Sanitary Commission also served an important role in rebuilding those cities, and in fact, in reducing death rates to not merely pre-war levels, but to improving even on that through the imposition of new sanitary standards. So the U.S. Sanitary Commission provides us with an example of organized citizen action at work. How average people united as a means of improving conditions and, for lack of a better word, imposing sanitary order in places where disorder had tended to reign. So, the key things that I'd like you to take away from this lecture are a deeper understanding of the themes discussed on Tuesday, the transformation of medicine from the age of Rush to a new age, and I don't know whether we want to sort of put a particular individual there, but something to think about. And as a means of showing that you watched this lecture, your assignment is to contribute to the Canvas discussion that I'm going to post, and ask you to simply write a couple of sentences up to a paragraph characterizing the transitions that I've been lecturing on this week. So, what happened during this 19th century period? And how did medical theory change as a result of these events and discoveries? Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next week.